Badlands, run into Badlands, explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good evening and welcome to the No Treason podcast, episode 8. I'm your host, Jonathan Drake. Thank you so much for joining me. Got quite an episode to get into this evening. I had a clean desk. We've been doing some deep cleaning down here in the basement, and my desk looked quite lovely, but then I got some stuff in the mail for the Pharaoh cell. I've got the LED strip and power controller. I've got a remote control for it. And then I've got, this is mouse milk and Pharaoh fluid. And I've got the optically flat glass sitting over there. I've already cleaned it off. I don't want to smudge it. I was playing around with it. I got it to work. I need to mix, figure out my mixture for the Pharaoh fluid and the mouse milk so that the magnetic field shows up a lot better. I was doing some testing on it to see whether or not this the wireless receiver for controlling the LEDs would affect the image on the viewer, and thankfully it doesn't. So I'm going to make a housing for it and then have it ready to go. I've got another camera set up on a tripod over here on the other side of my desk, and that will be a secondary camera for once we get into ether physics, which will be a little ways from now. We still have quite a bit of material to get through. We should be able to wrap up Spooner's essay next week, hopefully, but then we're going to transition into some other things Spooner related, which I'll talk about a little bit later. As far as a recap for last week, I ended with the question, what other conclusion can we reach than this was by design? So I closed out last week with an observation that Spooner wrote his essay exposing the evils of allowing a government to borrow money 43 years before the creation of the Federal Reserve, which demonstrates his awareness of the problem of governments going into debt and what they must do in order to make good on that debt. We are hyper-focused on the Federal Reserve, and for good reason. I watched the documentary Money Masters by William Still. If you've not seen that, it's a great primer into how the Fed works, the history of fractional reserve banking, and so on. I watched that when I was 12, maybe 13. My family was a little bit odd. We liked watching that sort of thing. And so I knew back then, I'm 42 now, how evil that institution was, and pretty much how I just realized when I was a junior higher, like, wow, my life is screwed because of these evil people. And we can track the destruction of our buying power of the US dollar through that fractional reserve banking system. And then we can trace its destructive power right back to the Federal Reserve. So it's not entirely a waste of time to study it and to call that evil out. But Spooner showed us last week that blaming the Fed is sort of like, I mean, he didn't use this analogy, this was mine, but it's sort of like blaming the gun in a murder. Yes, it is a tool of tremendous subversion, but rather than being the originator of our problem, it was just the next logical step in the global cabal's goals of centralization, and as such is simply just a streamlining agent of the overall problem. The real culprit is the government borrowing money in the first place, which it must do because very few people would willingly pay for the evils that it commits. And certainly not under the document it was formed from. Remember that the men who wrote it never even signed it. In spite of claiming to own vast stretches of this part of the earth, the government has no actual collateral other than the promise to rob and murder, the murder being necessary if the robbery is resisted. As such, there's no real motivation for them to pay off the debt, but to continue borrowing, because without debt, there's no excuse to tax. There's a great quote I'm going to include a little bit later from Alexander Hamilton on that exact idea. And without the taxation, they have no real means of providing for their own wealth and the wealth of their benefactors. And therein lies the reason why the government always grows. It has nothing to do with policy. It has nothing to do with political ideology. It has nothing to do with economic theory. This is the reason why government will always get bigger. Why do we always find ourselves in a costly war, hot or cold? Why do we always find ourselves in some new technological race that requires great amounts of government investment? Why is everything always a crisis that requires the government to intervene with massive amounts of money? Why does the government build roads that don't last and need to be rebuilt continually? If they even do that, that's a whole other topic. It seems like it takes forever to get the government around here to repair the roads. And then when they do, it takes them forever to actually do that. Why does the government pay $1,000 for a toilet seat? Why does the government subsidize the sciences, especially ones that lead us away from God? Why does the government regulate every possible aspect of every possible industry? Why do you suppose everything is labeled an issue of national security? Why does the government get involved in welfare? Why does the government get involved in housing? Why does the government never shrink, regardless of who is in power or what little letter happens to be next to their name when they appear on the news? The answer is because the very purpose of this government, with its founding document giving it the key to unlock limitless credit guaranteed by our taxation and the taxation of our children and our children's children, its very purpose is to borrow money from the people who want to lend it and thereby control it and us. And like the corrupt NBA referee fixing games for the mafia, that sort of story has been in the news a fair amount lately. And I remember reading about that back in 2008 or whenever the last time it was exposed. Once you start working for them, you're really not allowed to quit, so they have to keep the grift going. It is therefore utterly meaningless to debate political theory, election analysis, policy directives, judicial drama, economic theory, etc., and believe that we are moving the ball forward as long as the government maintains the power to borrow money. They will never get rid of the national debt. It is their sole reason for existence. And as Spooner said, all political power, as it is called, rests on this matter of money. And knowing that, and knowing what we know from our own research, I'm sure many of you have done plenty of research into the banking cabal, we can examine the Constitution separate from Spooner's other critiques from the basis of natural law, as damning as those are, and find that its most dastardly designed feature was Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2, which gave the Congress the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. You combine that with the power to tax in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, which was necessary in order to even have the credit with the blood money loan mongers in the first place, credit that requires the debt servitude of you and your children, if they have their way, forever, and everything else that Spooner has talked about almost doesn't even matter, except that it does, because this one issue is literally the cipher to understand at least the last 500 years of human history and likely much longer, certainly much longer. But it has the especial relevance to our immediate history since it explains the founding of this country in the first place, if you want to wander down the conspiracy theory trail with me. How this government was created for the sole purpose of borrowing money, which justifies taxation, which makes them rich, and on and on and on. And how the manipulation of credit, not the sidebar issue of slavery, ultimately led to the tremendous upheaval of the Civil War, which should be viewed as an engineered cataclysm over a period of 30 to 40 years with the purpose of consolidating economic, financial, and political power into fewer hands. There was a glimmer of hope, briefly, in the few years following the Civil War, which we're getting some echoes of that again now. But those creditors at that time were more powerful, and the last 150 years has been their steady march towards centralization and dominance using this one power, that is loaning money to governments, manipulating credit, and receiving our tax money that they get rich off of. I'm sort of calling this my grand unified theory for how the global cabal screws our eyeballs out. I have other verbiage that I use in that phrase, but in the interest of keeping this somewhat family friendly, I'll keep it clean. I've been thinking and researching along these lines, and I'm working on a potential article for the Badlands Substack about all this. We shall see. It's still kind of just sort of rattling around up in there inside my freakishly large head. We'll definitely be touching on some of that next week, maybe even the week after. Certainly as we get into trial by jury, this topic will be surfacing quite a lot. And as we get into those sections, and as that essay, trial by jury, and as we wrap up this essay, we will finally get to the conversation that I know many of you have been patiently waiting for, which is essentially, what do we do instead? I am looking forward to that. I'm not pushing it off because I'm afraid to talk about it. As I've mentioned, I feel it's necessary to establish some boundaries and establish a foundation that makes such a conversation even possible. But tonight, we are going to continue with identifying the problems that we have to overcome. And we'll do that by continuing the shift. As I mentioned last week, Spooner began a shift with the sections that we're currently in, away from a theoretical and moral analysis of the Constitution itself and into more of trying to answer the question that all of his critiques of the Constitution demand, which is, of course, who really is in charge? Who are the real rulers? But before we get into that, let's go ahead and get into some ad breaks. I mentioned a glimmer of hope in the 1860s and the possible echoes reverberating in our time. The echo, for those who are willing to hear it, is of an alliance, a sovereign alliance, seeking to push back and make a stand against the evil powers that would be. Rise Attire has heard that echo and is doing their part to join the fight, and so can you.
What is the Sovereign Alliance? The Sovereign Alliance are a collection of leaders and countries that are aligned not in the vision for their countries, but against a vision that has been thrust upon them. I believe that the Sovereign Alliance is less a battle for something and more a battle against something. They are against globalism, collectivism. They are against the rules-based international order.
Sovereign Alliance, the latest addition to Badlands Rise merch, available now at badlandsmedia.tv/rise.
Now, you can't very well take on and destroy a millennia-old cabal of Satan-worshipping, blood money, loan-mongering pedophiles who have managed to infiltrate every aspect of our modern lives, ever pushing us to reject God and settle for a life of slavery and subservience without getting a restful night of sleep. And for that, we turn to the InfoWar quartermaster, Mike Lindell, and MyPillow.
I'm excited to announce that we're having our biggest 3-in-1 sale ever with a limited edition product, a back in stock special, and a closeout deal you won't find anywhere else. So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to get our MyPillow bed sheets only $29.88. Any color, any style, any size, even kings, regular $119.98, only $29.88. Once they're gone for good. How about our My Towels? They're finally back in stock, but not for long. Get a 6-piece My Towel set, regular $69.98, now only $39.98. And for the first time and the only time ever, get our limited edition premium My Pillows. They're made with Giza cotton and designer gusset. Queen $17.98, Kings only $19.98. So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to get the best offers ever. Quantities are extremely limited, so order now.
And rounding out the Fight the Deep State while feeling good about yourself starter kit, we have Badlands Media's very own hard-hitting soft disclosure.
Before skincare went synthetic, people used something simple, something real, tallow. Grass-fed and finished beef tallow is packed with vitamins A, D, E, and K. Nutrients your skin actually knows what to do with. It locks in moisture, restores elasticity, and defends against winter dryness. No water, no preservatives, and no BS. Unlike plant oils or chemical creams, tallow mimics your skin's own structure. Elbows, hands, knees, post-shave, anywhere your skin's crying for real moisture. Perfect for gifting or keeping your own skin soft when the cold hits. Visit softdisclosure.com and use promo code Badlands for 15% off. Ancient care, modern truth.
Soft disclosure. When I went to visit my mom a couple of months ago, I took my MyPillow with me, and I completely forgot it in my hotel room. I think I mentioned that a couple weeks ago. They are back ordered right now, so I'm still waiting on my replacement. I did order one, and I just received an email the other day assuring me that they haven't forgotten about me and they're working very hard to fulfill my order, which is good because my wife traveled recently, and while she was gone, I snagged her pillow and was using it, and she was thoroughly appalled that I would do such a horrible thing. Apparently, my pillows are not for sharing, so I'm looking forward to getting mine back. And speaking of my mom, I know a number of you have been praying for her, and I appreciate that. The news so far is very good. The prognosis, she was diagnosed with cancer back in the beginning of September, and it was a freakishly fast-growing sarcoma. She had discovered a lump on her left lymph node in the second week of August or something like that, and in less than a month, it had grown. Like when I saw her, it was the size of and shape of like a large sweet potato on the side of her face, and had spread into her bones. And the prognosis was very dire. We were basically told that she had days or weeks, and she's still alive. I feel kind of crass even saying it that way. She did end up doing chemotherapy treatment. She's looking into doing, she's very, very crunchy. She's into foraging. She's into all sorts of alternative health treatments and essential oils and all that sort of stuff. But they made a decision to go ahead and do chemotherapy, just given how rapidly it was growing. And I'm very thankful. The Lord has been very good in preserving her life and letting her respond well to the chemo. Obviously, it's been pretty rough. She just finished her third round, and they're waiting, I think, until next week to get imaging done to see whether or not it's in their bones. But at this point, the tumor is down to like just the size of they can still kind of feel it, but it's like half the size of a grape or something. So that's very awesome. So I appreciate very much the prayers, and would ask that you continue to do that as you think about it. Obviously, it was just such a freakish. I mean, you just don't expect that to happen. My mom is only 69 years old, so it's not like she's super old or anything like that. She's extremely healthy, so it just kind of came out of left field. So we're very thankful for the positive response so far. Moving on to some live chat comments. Polymathonon dropped $10 last week. He said, love you, brother. Hope you're doing the good work here. And I appreciate that and love you back. AOB 22, $10. Jonathan, thank you for all this great work. And I found out that Spooner was the father of the smoked pork butt. Now, fun fact, I don't think he's actually the father of the smoked pork butt. I think someone from the South probably could claim that. But the cut of meat used in pulled pork, which has its origins as a method of serving in the southern states, is often called a Boston butt. And Spooner, being from the Boston area, well, we're halfway there to his confirmation as patriarch of the smoked pork butt. All right, let's get into Section 18, the real rulers. Spooner presents a two-tiered system, or maybe a two-headed hydra, if you will, for who the real rulers are. Number one, you have the forward-facing, boots on the ground, tip of the spear, those who are willing to be the actual tyrants, or the ones that we can see. And then number two, the financiers, those who bankroll their tyranny and get obscenely rich off of it. Let's go ahead and start with number one. We'll begin by describing just what it is these rulers actually do. Excuse me. Let's pull this up. The Constitution having never been signed by anybody, and there being no other open, written, or authentic contract between any parties whatever, by virtue of which the United States government, so-called, is maintained, and it being well known that none but male persons of 21 years of age and upwards are allowed any voice in the government, and it being also well known that a large number of these adult persons seldom or never vote at all, and that all those who do vote do so secretly by secret ballot, and in a way to prevent their individual votes from being known either to the world or even to each other. This is a long enough quote. I got to split it up into two. So they're not even known to each other. And consequently, in a way to make no one openly responsible for the acts of their agents or representatives. All these things being known, he basically summed up the entire essay right there. The questions arise: who compose the real governing power in the country? Who are the men, the responsible men, who rob us of our property, restrain us of our liberty, subject us to their arbitrary dominion, and devastate our homes and shoot us down by the hundreds of thousands if we resist? How shall we find these men? How shall we know them from others? How shall we defend ourselves and our property against them? Who of our neighbors are members of this secret band of robbers and murderers? How can we know which of their houses that we may burn or demolish them, which their property that we may destroy it, which their persons that we may kill them and rid the world and ourselves of such tyrants and monsters? These are the questions that must be answered before men can be free, before they can protect themselves against this secret band of robbers and murderers who now plunder, enslave, and destroy them. Just a disclaimer, I don't, and Badlands Media does not endorse actually physically going to your neighbors and doing that. There are other ways and peaceful ways of achieving liberty, which we'll get into at some point. But these are the questions that must be answered before men can be free. I've said many times that if we don't accurately describe the problem, then we have no hope of effecting a solution, and even recognizing a solution when it does arrive. And if in the interest of pragmatism, our solution violates our morals and the fabric of reality itself, i.e. natural law, then our solution will not be a solution at all, but will be just a different iteration of the same problem. Thanks to Spooner, we can acutely identify the serious problems with our government's contract as it is written, how it actually establishes the tyranny such as we have now, or in the interest of being charitable, was just simply unable to prevent it, hearkening to Spooner's quote in the appendix. And thanks to Spooner, we have an applied moral framework rooted in a biblical first principle. So, who can we blame for the government such as we have now? How do we identify this problem so that we can avoid it when we apply all of that to a solution? Spooner writes, let me pull this up. The answer to these questions is that only those who have the will and the power to shoot down their fellow men are the real rulers in this, as in all other so-called civilized countries. For by no others will civilized men be robbed or enslaved. Tyranny is only as effective as the boots on the ground are willing to make it. That's something I've been saying for much of my adult life. These are your coworkers. These are your neighbors, your family. Sometimes, a lot of times, it's us, it's me, it's you. Anyone who is willing to use the power of the state to get what they want. Anyone who is happy to enslave you by proxy to get the comfort they want, the roads they want, the market protections they want, the subsidies they want, the security they want. Of course, the joke is on them, because by selling you out, they're actually selling out themselves. We sell out ourselves when we appeal to the state to solve our problems. This is ultimately why I consider voting to be a moral issue. I've gotten a lot of pushback on this over the years, probably still will. But going back to the speech and debate clause, we saw that there really is no political solution, because even if elections were real, our only option is to replace someone with absolute and irresponsible power with another person with absolute and irresponsible power. In other words, we're just slaves choosing a new slave master and thinking that somehow that makes us free. Going back also to the discussion about property rights, where Spooner set up A, B, and C voting to deputize D to steal from E, neither A, B, C, or D, as people, had any right individually to take E's property against his will. Doing so would make them usurpers. It would make them criminals. Participating in an electoral process which guarantees as an outcome that people's consent, their property rights, their legitimate absolute and irresponsible power, participating in that electoral process guarantees that your consent will be violated, and it places you firmly in the position of violating natural law. You become the tyrant. We become the thing that we ironically are voting to prevent. And from the perspective of the victim, what difference does it make whether it's a king or an elected president if the outcome is the same? How can we do this and claim to be a freedom-loving people? Spooner used the fact that the northern financial institutions were heavily involved in financing the southern slave economy as evidence for the hypocrisy of their forward-facing abolitionist sentiments and motivations for the Civil War. We'll get into that next week. He might similarly compare our typical statements about caring about liberty to our actions at the ballot that prove otherwise. It's just something to consider. But those boots on the ground, the ones willing to rough us up and take our money, they cost money. A paid group of thugs willing to rob their neighbors costs money. Facilitating a massive apparatus of fraud and villainy costs money. So now we get to the real heart of the matter, the actual real rulers. If you've read Soft War or listened to G Money, I know I probably just triggered a number of you with that, and I don't really apologize. Or if you listen to anyone else on Badlands talking about power projection, you'll be familiar with the way Spooner describes the progression or the evolution of power and control among men. I won't provide a direct quote, but he describes that among savages, basically just two individual men, mere physical strength or skill can determine the victory in a contest. This, in the context of what we're talking about here would be like a lone mugger in the back alley with a knife and you don't have anything, or some reprobate holding up a convenience store and stealing Twinkies or something. Among barbarians, a trained group of disciplined men may enslave, rob, and kill a larger group of men. So the discipline and the training is capable of overcoming numerical odds. But he says that in the age of sprawling civilization and advancements in weaponry capable of tremendous killing power, how does one actually gain control? And to that, he writes, but with so-called civilized peoples, among whom knowledge, wealth, and the means of acting in concert have become diffused, scroll down here a little bit, and who have invented such weapons and other means of defense as to render mere physical strength of less importance, and by whom soldiers in any requisite number and other instrumentalities of war in any requisite amount can always be had for money, the question of war, and consequently the question of power, is little else than a mere question of money. As a necessary consequence, those who stand ready to furnish this money are the real rulers. It is so in Europe, and it is so in this country. I'll remind you of Spooner's declaration that all power, as it is called, rests on the matter of money. So we have two rulers, those who are willing to steal, kill, and enslave their neighbors by proxy because they're too cowardly to do it themselves, the secret band of robbers and murderers, and then included in this category are their designees whom they hire to actually do the dirty work. These would be the emperors, the kings, etc. Spooner writes that they are little or nothing else than mere tools employed by the wealthy to rob, enslave, and if need be, murder those who have less wealth or none at all. And then they're the tools of the second group of rulers, those who are willing to finance them doing so. Let's talk about that second group of rulers. The Rothschilds and that class of moneylenders of whom they are the representatives and agents, men who never think of lending a shilling to their next door neighbors for the purposes of honest industry, unless upon the most ample security and at the highest rate of interest, stand ready at all times to lend money in unlimited amounts to those robbers and murderers who call themselves governments, to be expended in shooting down those who do not submit quietly to being robbed and enslaved. Now, this is the extent. I'm sure many of your ears perked up hearing him mention the Rothschilds, but this is the extent that Spooner mentions any specific names. His language about of whom they are the representatives and agents makes me think that he was at least open to the idea that anything outward facing isn't likely the true power, meaning we probably don't know the names of who pulls the Rothschild strings or the Rockefellers or any of the other big family names that get brought up in this community. But at the very least, the class of moneylenders is an archetype for the real power behind power. And we'll see that in particular, I've mentioned a couple times already, when we get to section 19 and his expose on the real cause for the Civil War. Why do these people do this? Why do they loan money to robbers and murderers? They lend money in this manner, knowing that it is to be expended in murdering their fellow men for simply seeking their liberty and their rights, knowing also that neither the interest nor the principal will ever be paid, except as it will be extorted under the terror of the repetition of such murders as those for which the money lent is to be expended. These men, these families, this class of moneylenders, this archetype of the real power behind power, make vast fortunes loaning money to the secret band of robbers and murderers, collecting interest on their loans through taxation, feigning legitimacy through various ideologies and methodologies of statism. This is why I've mentioned why I believe the very concept of elections themselves, at least as we've always seen them done in our lifetimes or even in this country, was a very cunning invention by these moneylenders to placate an increasingly restless people who were tired of being lorded over by overt tyrants. What better way to occupy the feeble minds of us peasants than to get us wrapped up in meaningless election cycles, 30-second sound bites, little letters next to people's names, and endless analysis of electoral patterns and polling and focus groups and other worthless nonsense. And we memorize slogans like "it's the economy, stupid," and other things like that. And while we squabble to control the sword that extorts us, we completely ignore who benefits from that extortion, who doesn't really care who wields that sword so long as they continue to borrow and tax, rob and murder, and pay up. This function alone is enough to make these people ridiculously rich, but they have devised other means of amassing wealth. When these great lenders of blood money, like the Rothschilds, have loaned vast sums of money in this way for the purposes of murder to an emperor or a king, they sell out the bonds taken by them in small amounts to anybody and everybody who are disposed to buy them at satisfactory prices to hold as investments. They, the Rothschilds, thus soon get back their money with great profits and are now ready to lend money in the same way again to any other robber and murderer called an emperor or a king, who they think is likely to be successful in his robberies and murders and able to pay a good price for the money necessary to carry them on. Now, as I understand it, I didn't pull that up. My apologies. If you want to take a screenshot of that, you're welcome to. As I understand it, the selling of bonds was one of the ways the Rothschilds gained such domination in England in the 1800s. But when I read this, I was struck at how similar it sounded to the U.S. Treasury bonds. I won't explore this any further now for the sake of time, but if you apply the concepts that we learned last week, then U.S. Treasury bonds are really quite loathsome to consider. It's essentially just buying a piece of the debt that was incurred in the pursuit of enslaving you, which is they're getting your taxes, paying the interest, and then they're taking the money that they haven't taken from you in taxes that you're buying in Treasury bonds and taking it from you that way as well. I know there's lots of intricacies to that, and that was probably an absolute butchering of the way that thing works, but it made sense to me, at least when I was thinking about it. But back to Spooner. This business of loaning blood money is one of the most thoroughly sordid, cold-blooded, and criminal that was ever carried on to any considerable extent amongst human beings. It is like lending money to slave traders or to common robbers and pirates to be repaid out of their plunder. And the men who loan money to governments, so-called, for the purposes of enabling the latter to rob, enslave, and murder their people, are among the greatest villains the world has ever seen. And they as much deserve to be hunted and killed, if they cannot otherwise be got rid of, as any slave traders, robbers, or pirates that ever lived. Hard-hitting words. What do the governments do with the money? Now think back to section 3, which we covered in episode 3, and the 4 points that Spooner raises as to why the paying of taxes does not equal consent to the contract of the Constitution. Point 4 is, and I've mentioned this a number of times, even in this episode, all political power, as it is called, rests practically upon this matter of money. Any number of scoundrels having money enough to start with can establish themselves as a government, because with the money they can hire soldiers, and with soldiers extort more money, and also compel general obedience to their will. It is with government, as Caesar said it was in war, that money and soldiers mutually supported each other, that with money he could hire soldiers, and with soldiers extort money. So these villains who call themselves governments well understand that their power rests primarily upon money. With money they can hire soldiers, and with soldiers extort money. And when their authority is denied, the first use they always make of money is to hire soldiers to kill or subdue all who refuse them more money. So that's what he said in section 3. And he continues that thought here in section 18. When these emperors and kings, so-called, have obtained their loans, they proceed to hire and train immense numbers of professional murderers called soldiers and employ them in shooting down all who resist their demands for money. And thus we have the cycle. Borrow money on the premise or on the promise to rob and murder, hire boots on the ground willing to do just that, rob and murder and thus increase your credit, borrow more money on the promise to rob and murder even more, hire more boots on the ground to do just that, and rinse and repeat over and over and over. And again, this goes back to why government never gets any smaller and why they will never pay off the debt, because it gives them the pretext to hire more people to rob and murder you if you resist the robbing, because how dare you? If that is the moneylenders, if they doubt his, that is the king or the emperor or the president, if they doubt his ability to make his murders successful for the maintaining his power and thus extorting money from his people in the future, they, the moneylenders, dismiss him as unceremoniously as they would dismiss any other hopeless bankrupt who should want to borrow money to save himself from open insolvency. This should give you insight into politicians who suddenly flame out. It's like, whatever happened to, this guy or that congresswoman or that senator? It also should tell you about those who linger on for decade after decade. They're very good at this game of borrowing and taxing. Now, governments, so-called, to borrow Spooner's phrasing, would collapse without these loanmongers. They could not sustain themselves for a moment but for the loans made to them by these blood money loanmongers. And their first care is to maintain their credit with them, for they know their end is come the instant their credit with them fails. This right here should give you insight into all of the drama surrounding continuing resolutions and discussions about the debt ceiling and all that sort of nonsense. Their primary focus is maintaining their credit so they can borrow and you have the excuse to tax. Now, at some point, I think a deeper dive into the reasons why the Articles of Confederation were usurped by the Constitution is warranted. But relevant to this topic here is the complaint of many founding fathers that the Congress at the time, under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress was unable or was not empowered to levy a tax, and that impacted negatively their public credit. The phrase public credit was used quite often in communications of political figures of the time, and it was referring not to just a reputation, but specifically financial credit, just to throw that out there. There are no sacred cows among, there's no sacred cows for Lysander Spooner, and so really I don't think there should be with us. So in that light, consider this quote from George Washington in a letter to Henry Knox in 1787. George Washington writes, "If no means are devised to draw forth the resources of the country, i.e. taxes, we must sink under a heavy load of debt, and we shall be unable to obtain loans abroad, for our credit will be lost." I was able to find many such quotes from many different founding fathers. And here's one. That's a very on-the-nose one from everyone's favorite founding father to dunk on, Alexander Hamilton. He writes, "A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will create a necessity for keeping up taxation and will also give us credit abroad." When they tell you what they're trying to do, you should listen to them. It's like what was that, Event 201 or whatever it was prior to COVID, when they game theoried out a coronavirus pandemic. Oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. It's like, no, when these people tell you what they're wanting to do, you should probably listen to them. Now, armed with Spooner's perspective on government debt and to whom the debt is owed, I would recommend that you do a search on your own for similar quotes from other founding fathers. You will find that there's quite a number of them, the ones especially that were in favor of ratification of the Constitution. And you will see that there is an inherent link between the Congress's inability at that time to levy a tax and how that impacted their ability to borrow money. But understanding the dynamic that the sole purpose of borrowing money is so that they can tax, and thus begins the cycle of the government ever expanding and growing and having new reasons and new excuses for borrowing even more money and raising even more tax. And think about all of that in context of the book of Proverbs in the Bible. Chapter 22, verse 7 states very obviously that the borrower is the slave to the lender. So if they're borrowing all that money, they are the slave to someone who's actually pulling their strings, and that's who we're talking about. These money lenders, this is the second group and really the more superior group of actual rulers of this country and pretty much every other country. Thus, it is evident that all these men who call themselves by the high-sounding names of emperors, kings, sovereigns, monarchs, most Christian majesties, most Catholic majesties, high mightinesses, most serene and potent princes, and the like, I love his sarcasm here, and who claim to rule by the grace of God, by divine right, that is, by special authority from heaven, are intrinsically not only the merest miscreants and wretches engaged solely in plundering, enslaving, and murdering their fellow men, but that they are also the merest hangers-on. Was there a discussion in the Cocoa Beach chat about dingleberries, I believe? They're the merest hangers-on. These guys are dingleberries. The servile, obsequious, fawning dependents and tools of these blood money loanmongers, on whom they rely for the means to carry on their crimes. These loanmongers, like the Rothschilds, laugh in their sleeves and say to themselves, these despicable creatures who call themselves emperors and kings and majesties and most serene and potent princes, who profess to wear crowns and sit on thrones, who deck themselves with ribbons and feathers and jewels and surround themselves with hired flatterers and lick spittles, and whom we suffer to strut around and palm themselves off upon fools and slaves as sovereigns and lawgivers specially appointed by Almighty God, and to hold themselves out as the sole fountains of honors and dignities and wealth and power. All these miscreants and impostors know that we make them and use them, that in us they live, move, and have their being, that we require them, as the price of their positions, to take upon themselves all the labor, all the danger, and all the odium of all the crimes they commit for our profit, and that we will unmake them, strip them of their gewgaws, and send them out into the world as beggars, or give them over to the vengeance of the people they have enslaved the moment they refuse to commit any crime we require of them, or to pay over to us such share of the proceeds of their robberies as we see fit to demand. In case you've never heard the word gewgaws before, like me, I looked it up and it means showy but useless trinkets or ornaments. And this was specifically Spooner writing about the politics of Europe, as especially true then. But given the recent funeral for Dick Cheney, a lot of that pomp and circumstance comes into play as well. Now, this eviscerating breakdown of the relationship between the hired thugs, who assume lofty titles for themselves and grand and moral purposes to obfuscate their crimes, and their benefactors, the real power behind the power, follow the money, is primarily descriptive of the political balance of power in Europe, at least as Spooner sees it. However, Section 19 begins. Now, what is true in Europe is substantially true in this country. Before I get to the conclusion, I wanted to point out one of the lines in this description of the relationship between the moneylenders and their tools is this line here, that in us they live and move and have their being. This is Spooner flexing his knowledge of the Bible. It's a quote from the speech that the Apostle Paul gives on the Areopagus in, I believe it's in Athens, where he's engaging with Greek philosophers. Oops, I forgot to pull that up. Where he's engaging with the philosophers in Greece, and he's quoting their own poets and their own writers in telling them that the altar to the unknown God, he's saying actually it's the Creator, and that we in him we live and move and have our being, which solved a conundrum that a lot of Greek philosophers wondered about as far as how motion was even possible, but that I won't get into all that. But the fact that Spooner attributes it to these moneylenders, this quote, is his direct accusation that these people, they are not just trying to control, they are trying to be gods. And given whom they serve, Satan, then I would argue that is really Satan speaking through them. Now, in the interest of time, getting close to an hour here, I would love to get into Section 19, but I don't want to rush the material that we're going to get into in that section. And that's going to be wrapping up the essay, so I don't want to rush that either. But Spooner's grand theory of politics and liberty really does come down to the matter of money. Next week, we're going to examine the American version. As I read, the beginning of Section 19 states what is true in Europe is substantially true in this country. Due to the nature of the heart of man, it is an unfortunate reality that as long as there is someone willing to pay, there will be someone to rob and murder their fellow man. Most people aren't willing to march door to door with a gun and make their demands. But if you layer on euphemistic fantasies like voting, constitutional republic, or our democracy, people are able to morally compartmentalize and give their consent to great horrors being perpetrated on their neighbors and really on themselves, although they don't realize it, because most people, I don't think, have really thought this through. And so thus there's a steady supply of lethal tools for the financing class of rulers. The criminals for hire are a vile group, no doubt, but Spooner has an especially deep hatred for those willing to fund their activities and amass unfathomable wealth, blood money, by doing so. As we will see next week, there is no limit to the destruction that they are willing to fund in order to consolidate their control and gain power, and there's no moral boundary that they are not willing to trample. All it takes is some clever and somewhat believable marketing to sell the idea that they are the most noble, the most God-fearing among us, and what would we ever do without them? Given the history of financial manipulation and dominance, such a question seems more like a threat than a helpful warning. A byproduct of waking up, or really the point of waking up, to frame it as Chris Paul does, to not get hoodwinked again, is to have the eyes to see the psyops all around us. As a number of us are fond of saying, it's psyops all the way down. And applying Chris Paul's maxim that the fake news of today is the history of tomorrow, we can look back in time and understand that the history of today was the fake news of yesterday. And with that in mind, we will examine Spooner's explanation for how the U.S. Civil War was really brought about, and expounding off his insights, we will see a pattern that explains most of the history of this country. And all of it was made possible by that hallowed and sacred document known as the U.S. Constitution, with the specific powers it enumerated that all but guaranteed subservience to the international banking cartel. that those powers, to borrow and tax, fit hand in glove with the main weapon the enemy uses to control kings and countries cannot be an accident. So we are left to decide if the founding fathers were simply naive to that danger or willing accomplices. Now, we will hopefully wrap up Spooner's essay, the one we've been going through, No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, number 6, next week. And then we will set ourselves up to begin the dig into his very lengthy essay, Trial by Jury, although I'm not going to cover the entire thing. And then we will using it, plus Spooner's take on property rights, a biblical reframing or relensing of natural law, and then an understanding of how the enemy manipulates and controls us, we will finally discuss what a natural law honoring and thus God honoring society might look like, and hopefully how we can get there with steps that we as individuals can take that eventually coalesce into a movement. So we'll get to that next. We'll finish up the essay next week, and then we'll get into all that stuff in the weeks following. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure. I am tired. I'm actually feeling a little bit under the weather, so hopefully I'll wake up tomorrow and feel much better. But I'll see you all next week.
Why a spoon, cousin? Why not an axe?
Because it's dull, you twit. It'll hurt more.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.